Welcome to session 4 of People, a global dialogue on museums and their publics. If you're just joining, I'm Andrea Bayer, Deputy Director of Collections and Administration, and I'm delighted to be part of today's convening. Our hope is that these presentations will activate further discussion and that you'll join us in that conversation by participating in the chat with questions and comments. We're also offering closed captioning. You can turn closed captioning on or off by using the CC icon towards the bottom right of your Zoom toolbar. Our program will be recorded and made available for you to view at a later date. In this session, 3 speakers will reflect on issues of race and identity in their work, in museums, and within visual culture. They will address 3 difficult and urgent prompts. What must be done to keep a discussion of race alive in museums? Will we be able to see change? And if so, how can we evaluate progress? We might look at these questions from a variety of viewpoints, ranging from the works of art that we collect and exhibit, the narratives with which we describe and interpret them, the voices that carry out those interpretive acts, and the audiences we hope to inspire. Our speakers will no doubt add others, drawing from their own practices and scholarly endeavor. We will have the opportunity to hear from these outstanding speakers. Alexi Peskin, creator of astonishing works that are mixed media portraits of the African diaspora, whose facture of males embedded into wood that is stained with coffee and other materials and worked with gold leaf allude to the great power figures of the Congo Basin. He reflects in photography and elsewhere on his own identity that crosses nations and continents. Woo-Sung Kim is an assistant professor in the Department of English at Northeastern University. She's a poet and translator, but also a critic and an activist, co-founder of Offshoot, an art space for transnational activist conversation, and author of a forthcoming book that examines property and race in the context of the avant-garde and innovation in the arts. Mame-Fatou Niang is an associate professor of French studies at Carnegie Mellon University, whose work has focused on Afro-French identities. Professor Niang is a writer and a filmmaker, looking closely at Black Islam in France and women writers who are the children or grandchildren of immigrants to France. I'm inspired by her statement that 21st century universalism will be anti-racist or it won't be at all. Our moderator for this session will be Dr. Jonathan Michael Square, a historian and curator whose work focuses on Afro-diasporic fashion and visual culture, and who has thought deeply about enslaved people and fashion. He will bring the ideal voice to discuss further the presentations of our 3 speakers. I'm delighted to turn it over to our session participants.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm also really excited to be here on this panel with my panelists. And thank you, Jonathan, for moderating our conversation. I also wanted to thank Anne for organizing this panel. I know that it's a lot of work to organize a panel during this moment in our time. I know that there was a larger statement acknowledging settler colonialism made at this conference, but I did want to locate where I am physically and myself by stating that Boston, where I am, is home to thousands of Indigenous people across Turtle Island. Massachusetts and their neighbors, the Wampanoag and Nipmuc people, have stewarded this land for hundreds of generations. This is unceded territory, and the fight against global settler colonialism is ongoing as we're watching at this moment. I also want to acknowledge that we're currently in the middle of a global pandemic. where harms and risks have been unevenly distributed to racialized communities, and white supremacist and anti-Black violence have been relentless all over the world. This is the context from which I speak from and I research from today. Okay, so with that being said, I'm gonna tell you a little bit about my research and the questions that I have been thinking about for the past few years by talking about the 1976 television show Batman, and particularly the episode Pop Goes the Joker. So this particular episode opens with a scene from an international art contest. The contestants announced range from Pablo Pincus to Jackson Potluck, Vincent van Gogh, and then the Joker. The artists performed various outlandish activities, everything from painting with their feet, dunking their bodies into a wheelbarrow full of paint, and bringing in monkeys that throw tomatoes. Sites upon which the conservative icon Bruce Wayne remarks that art tends to be unrestrained, end quote. That's his remarks. And then among the simulacra, Joker stands in front of the canvas with a paintbrush. He ultimately doesn't paint anything, he leaves it blank, and announces that the painting is of a quote unquote dead bat, leaving the wealthy patron jurors astonished. Declared to be an artist depicting the emptiness of modern life, the Joker wins the contest and promptly states that he will be opening an art school for millionaires only, a space exclusively for the rich, the well-born, and the able, end quote. The jurors immediately agreed to be benefactors of this new space. So in popular culture, the economic dynamics of canonical art history and modern art institutions are often depicted in this lighthearted, satirical, sardonic manner. The involvement of the rich, the well-born, is ridiculed, provoking, it's brushed away as inevitable, while simultaneously provoking queries into the institutionalization of art. As in, if art is supposed to be a shared understanding of expression, how do we explain the presence of right-wing 2.0 robber barons, such as the Koch brothers, Betsy DeVos, the Sacklers, frankly put, kind of like rapacious capitalists, as the primary patrons of museums and art, where the most important art is supposed to reside? So in order to take up the question that Anne prompted us for this panel, which was, how do we keep anti-Black racism and race more generally in conversation beyond this moment, I wanted to examine the history and context that leads up to this present moment, where anti-Blackness is, in the words of Christina Sharp, total climate. And in line with the other institutions in the US, museums and art spaces have been unique incubators of white supremacy and anti-Blackness. Conceived during the mid-20th century and early 21st centuries by members of the original robber baron class, Carnegie, Frick, Mellon, JP Morgan, Rockefeller, and others, museums illuminate the ideology primary to settler colonialism and racial capitalism. Many of the critiques put forth by artists and writers today have a historical lineage, from the whiteness of museum shows to the politics of board members. Is the episode Pop Goes the Joker onto something, what Raymond Williams called the structure of feeling, where it is understood that museums are not accidental spaces where whiteness and wealth are flourishing, but whiteness and wealth become primary to how aesthetic forms and collections become constructed. So in addressing this history, I'm going to take you very briefly through the case study of the Frick collection, which is actually right across from the Met if you're in New York City, and the rise of philanthropy and museums in the US. The Frick is one of the oldest examples of a personal collection to become a museum in the US. It's the former home of Henry Clay Frick, partner at the Carnegie Steel Company. And in the early 20th and late 19th century, as some of you may know, New York was not the city full of museums. At that moment, it had the Met, which opened in 1870, but did not have all the wings that it does now. The Frick was 1916 and MoMA was 1929. The people who began these institutions knew and spoke to each other, often were business partners, sat on each other's boards. And this is in great contrast to today, where, fun fact, there are more museums than Starbucks and McDonald's combined. So to give you a very short history on the wealth of the two robber barons, Carnegie and Frick owned and operated the majority of the steel plants in Pittsburgh along the Allegheny County. This remains the unceded regions of the Iroquois people, the Lenape, the Seneca, amongst others. And looking into their financial history, one of the first things that I learned about was the Homestead Strike of 1892, which was one of the first violent labor strikes in U.S. history, where private militia and the National Guard were called in to open fire and capture striking workers, killing at least 8 and injuring countless others. And then after, the workers were tried for treason by the U.S. government for participating in the strike. So before the strike, when the unions existed in the mills, Carnegie was the richest man in the world, and the steel company had generated at least $4 million in profits that year. Adjusted for inflation, that would be about $110 million today. The main cause for the strike was that Carnegie and Frick refused to uphold the union contracts and wanted to bust them. They believed that without having worked a day in their lives at any of the steel plants, they could forcefully reorganize the labor process. After breaking the unions across industries, Carnegie Steel would go on to become US Steel, the first billion-dollar company in the world, not adjusted for inflation. $1 billion in the early 20th century is approximately $29.6 trillion today. And to give you a comparison, there is no company worth that much at this particular moment. There are about 6 or 7 companies that are worth $1 trillion at this moment, but no company is worth $29.6 trillion, which means that even though the wealth disparities of this current moment are unconscionable, US Steel and Carnegie's wealth far surpasses even the richest people and the richest companies in the world today. So what happened to the union at Homestead became normalized in US labor practices. And we see echoes of this to this day at Bessemer, across Amazon warehouses. And most 19th century and early 20th century historians have written about how without the violent union busting, and Rockefeller was responsible for what is considered the most violent labor strike against the laborers in US history, and that's the Colorado Coldfield War of 1913 to 1914. And Rockefeller was the primary patron to the expansion of the Met. So without this kind of violence against the laborers and the workers, we would not remember them, the robber barons, as philanthropists. And I would add, without extractive capitalism, which is predicated upon unceded land and settler colonialism, without racial capitalism and segregationist labor practices upon which the notion of work and worker is built, this moment would not be considered the Gilded Era. So even though it's important to add, and I can talk about this in the Q&A, even the unions at this particular moment did not accept Black workers into the union, so they were segregationist. And if they were not, that was the exception. And Homestead was no exception. So the workers at Homestead, when Black workers were brought in because they did not belong to a union, because unions were segregating against them, they rioted against the workers. The Black workers threatened to lynch them and destroyed their homes. So this is to say that even a successful union negotiation would not have resolved anti-Blackness. It would not have mitigated what was happening in terms of the total climate. But it's upon this wealth where the beginnings of Carnegie's philanthropic ventures and Frick's museum can begin. And Carnegie is noted as the father of modern philanthropy, and his version of philanthropy is the one that we're most familiar with even to this day. The de-unionized workers observed that Carnegie would gift the town a library after he had broken the town's union, and would ask, what good is it to them to have a library, to have a museum, if they're working 18 hours a day? Similarly, throughout the end of his life, Frick amassed an enormous art collection. And in his will, he left an art collection that was valued at $50 million then, which is $984 million today, along with an endowment and his mansion on the Upper East Side across from the Met. So before I began my research into the acquisition records, which is what my book project is really looking at, the acquisition records of gallery sales books, I was familiar with the Frick collection, and my hypothesis around the Homestead strike was that everyone was too busy, too tied up to pay attention to the workers, essentially, that they were reckless because they were doing other things like collecting art and figuring out how to begin philanthropic organizations. But really what you see, or what I saw, was that it's only after the strike of in 1894 that the art collection and collecting begins. So philanthropy was to be the conclusion to the moralizing narrative of wealth. It heralded a narrative after life from the violence of capitalism for the benefactor. Carnegie would go on to build 2,811 libraries, multiple concert halls, peace centers, and a university. Frick would go on to amass a private art collection that would be called a museum. When philanthropy is often discussed, it's done so through the discourse of their money and their desires and their ideas and their art. When asked about the motivations behind philanthropy, Bloomberg replied that you can't spend it all and you can't take it with you when you die. It's rationalized that capitalism affords them the right to spend their spoils, considered winnings, as they see fit, even though they themselves admit they cannot. What they've accumulated is beyond them. Before concluding, I want to take a moment to discuss the steel and coke industries, its legacies in the future, as this is incredibly important to the discussion. So in 2014, the UN released a series of reports stating that if soil degradation continues at its current rate, there will be 60 harvests left in the world. And it sounds very apocalyptic, but the report was noting how generating even like 3 centimeters of topsoil takes 1,000 years. And because of intensified global warming, it's been difficult for this to happen, if not impossible. Carnegie and Frick sold steel, a man-made material catalyzed by coke, a type of fuel derived from heating coal. So the rise of steel industries in Pittsburgh coincides with coal mining that began in the mid-18th century. Coal mining began as an early colonial enterprise, and racial capitalism gave way to the materials of the Industrial Revolution: steel, iron, the bones of railroads, bridges, buildings. What is now known about coal mining is that it depletes the earth, destroying the topsoil so that it cannot be used in future farming. Additionally, coal has been the largest contributor to the human-made increase of CO2. There's a series of reports that was released in 2017 that tracked the top 100 companies responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions. And this is companies since 1988. And the top companies have all some kind of relation to coal. So it's not difficult to imagine the havoc that was wreaked prior to 1988 by the robber barons of the Gilded Era. So when W.E.B. Du Bois prompts the dark and vast sea of human labor in China and India, the South Seas and all Africas, the West Indies and Central Americas, and the United States, on whose bent and broken backs rest today the founding stones of modern industry, spawning the world's raw material and luxury, how shall we end the list and where? This is a most pressing question, as extracting natural resources from the earth is a process of world-altering capitalism. And as Marx writes, it quarantines poverty into the future. Thus, it is true that the blueprint for the robber barons, their philanthropic projects, their ideas live with us today. The richest man in the world then, and the history of the Gilded Era is linked to our very present moment, from library systems, museums, philanthropy, capitalism, and the number of harvests that we may have left. So as another dawn of robber barons embark upon us, and I'm almost done, as individual wings of museums are presented to the public with applause and personal collections erected with little protest, One way to continue critical conversations about institutional anti-Blackness, colonialism, and race would be to actively refuse the neutrality of the museum space or consider them to be their gifts. It's imperative to understand the politics carried forth as sacred aesthetics expression and repatriate their havens in its entirety. And I end with this quote by Aimé Césaire, EI for those who never invented anything, for those who never conquered anything. The things that they tried to give and give us reflect all that has and continues to be lost. And in the absence of those who never invented, conquered anything, too remains a continued, ongoing, unforgettable presence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hyun Song, for this very, very compelling, itinéraire, the way you took us down history, but also this circulation that you made very apparent between all these elements. And again, I wanted to echo the thank you for Anne for putting together such a timely event, and also thank you for my co-panelists for being here. So I'm taking everybody to France, and so right now, the conversation between these three elements, museum, race, and the public, right, revolve around two questions. The first one being the denial of race as a valid category of analysis in France. And from there, just, try to imagine the complexities, the barriers that can arise from wanting to hold a debate like this, right, a debate between these two elements. And the second question is the current conversation debates around the return of colonial artifact. But beyond these two questions, these two elements, we also having or trying to have conversation debates on the role of museum as central space, not just for public conversation like these, this literal agora that enable conversation, that we're having, like the one that we're having tonight, and as part of their public mission, but also think of the museum in a French context as spaces that enable wider conversation on how empire, right, is not over, conversation on the many regimes of coloniality, from the physical return of stolen colonial artifact to accountability, to ensuring that these dialogues that we're trying to create open doors for new balances in the relations between the global North and the global South, to the way we can think of the wider ways that museums here, as well as other institutions such as academia, the arts, the media, TV, exactly, at large, are still upholding empire and a developing, anchoring an idea of French identity conflated with and understood as whiteness and white supremacy. So I will give you a quick snapshot from France. I am Afro-French. I come from a country that built race, a country that built its fortune on race, a country that still operates on race, but pretends that erasing the words has magically dissolved racism and coloniality, and the very need to talk about race. And in the 16 years that I've worked on Blackness, race, racism in France, I've never seen anything like the wave that swept through the country following the death of George Floyd last year. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands mobilized all over France, the biggest anti-racism movement in contemporary history. And like many others, I felt like that we were riding an unprecedented wave, although I really, abhor that word, unprecedented, but it was unprecedented in our opinion. That gush that had finally disintegrated what we call the Republican Dam, that barrier that historically contained works on race and memory. And that hope was very short-lived, as the backlash to this movement was swift and came from the highest levels of the state. Thinking about President Macron accusing university campuses, social scientists, artists, activists of being, quote, secessionists, of breaking the republic in two, of racializing social questions, end quote, and of luring young people in the streets by selling them false hope. And I can also think of the Minister of Higher Education, Frédéric Vidal, who a couple of months ago called for an official inquest into the dictatorship of minorities and post-colonial studies in universities in a bid, and these are her word, to understand why Confederate flags were flying in the US Capitol and we're in France. So she related research on gender and race to what she called Islamo-Maoism, the unlikely scion of Mao Zedong and Iran's Ayatollah Khamenei. And in this world that they live in, that we live in, the Republic, Frenchness, universalism, free speech are said to be under attack by gender and race-based traders who are arbitrarily projecting onto French realities notions that are imported from abroad. And when I say abroad, it's the United States of America, and who are ready to cancel people who don't agree with them. And in such a context, the questions framing our debate tonight have a particular resonance in France. You know, how do we keep anti-Black racism? And actually for us, it's how do we bring and race and anti-Black racism, you know, more generally in the conversation beyond what I call in one of my articles, the 2020 summer of racial reckoning, you know, French people discovering that race was a thing in 2020. Will there be genuine changes that flow from this conversation? What are the structures of accountability and how is progress evaluated? Well, race should not exist in the Republican narrative. This is why we're here. 2 years ago, I was declared one of the most racist persons in the country, an active agent of bringing back the disease that is race and racism, because I call out this work of art. It's one of the very few monuments commemorating the abolition of slavery. It's been at the French Parliament for 30 years. This is the fresco commemorating the first time France abolished slavery in 1794. It's been at the Assemblée Nationale for 30 years, the Palais Bourbon. And my colleagues, Bryn Mars, Julien Ciodo, and I unleashed a tsunami when we called this a moral fault. We were told, and I mean, there were more than 300 articles in all French media, and we absolutely made a grand shalom with everybody from the far right to the far left agreeing that we were wrong. We were told that the piece could not be racist because one, it commemorated the abolition of slavery. Two, race did not exist in France. We were the racists trying to import that concept in France. We were told that we were ignorant, incapable of seeing the piece for what it was, a fun attempt at caricature, a piece of irony in the purest French tradition. We were told that we were ayatollahs issuing a fatwa against the artist Hervé Dirosa. And people, you know, citing Voltaire, Charlie Hebdo, the sacredness of art, our detractors argued that this fresco was art and as such was free to shock. Then we repeatedly heard that people never learned in school that these signs were harmful. And that last part was, I mean, I'm not often shocked by France, was the most puzzling to me, you know, just the general apathy in France around the fresco, as people were largely unwilling, unable to read it as offending and blatantly racist. And that to me spoke volume about the flaws, or actually the success of our Republican ecosystem in erasing this sign from our collective memory. So to analyze the extraordinary piece of the Assemblée Nationale, I'm trying to unpack in a book that is coming out at the end of the year, the multiple interrogation that arose from this global movement last year to remove, rebrand, or tear down symbols of contentious past and rethink the role of our cultural institution in this movement, but I also anchor my research in the peculiar terrain of memorialization à la française, right, in a French context marked by denial and the many taboos around our colonial history and the role of museum as, you know, institution de mémoire, and in helping us shy away from this roman national, this national narrative that is really the cement of French DNA. And the main question that this fresco is asking me as a researcher that I'm trying to answer in this book: what does this say about France's relationship to truth, history, and memory? Is the democratization of memory possible in the context of such hegemonic narratives? How do we educate people on memory in a country where the construction of memory is a private turf, the exclusive domain of the state? I was told that I had no business trying to tell people that this was wrong because a museum or whatever space it was, you know, in this context, the Assemblée Nationale, who's considered a museum, it's a place that people visit for free, did enough work to contextualize the work. And it was none of my business to try to tell people that it was wrong. And So what do these voids and silences that I sometimes refer in my work as noisy silence says to whoever is ready to listen? Why do we do with the way these silences about our own history, the voids, right? The way they forged our national consciousness I'm sorry, of colonialism or slavery as being a foreign and American institution. Our environment in France remains desperately mum. I'm sorry. Our environment remains disparately mum about this history in the French context, about the French figures of Black emancipation who will never be immortalized by a station or high schools like Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, or Marielle Franco. And the way, you know, growing up, I often ask this question to my student that for us in France, slavery is an American institution. We think of, you know, Alex Haley's roots, plantations in Virginia and Louisiana. We think of cottons in Alabama, and we cannot think of it as being a French institution. And this process of being able to work on race in a country where race does not exist calls for a dialogue, a democratization of memory making that France is not ready to undertake right now, since for some, redress implies culpability. And as President Macron himself solemnly declared last June, the Republic will not erase any trace or any name from its history. It will not take down any statue. And right now it seems that education on race and memory is happening in real time and everywhere, but in textbooks and in institutional forums such as museum. And when you think of, you know, the very top-down public natures of museum, it's not where the conversation is happening right now, and it's happening everywhere, but on those places. So yeah, that poses multiple challenges when you think of the kind of dogma on who is an authorized, credible producer of knowledge. And I had this experience in April 2019 when people didn't care that I've been, you know, that I'm a scholar. I made films on the topic. I've been working on the topic for 16 years, and I was completely stripped of that knowledge. And, you know, the word militant was placarded everywhere. And I am not a official producer of knowledge. So who am I to get in, you know, in this battle with the French state? And in that sense, the current attempt at unveiling what is considered unpleasant memory and having these unpleasant conversations is severely frowned upon. But that does not stop this new generation of workers, art workers, artists, thinkers in Paris, Lyon, Bordeaux, but also in Martinique, Guadeloupe, and in all corners of France, from sorting out our post-colonial mythologies. And what we are undertaking today is neither cancel culture nor a vengeful quest for repentance. It's our actions are fueled by the realization that France can no longer hide behind a pseudo-universalism that refuses to live in the present. And I'm happy to leave now the stage to one such actor, French visual artist Alexi Peskin. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, and Hannah, everybody for inviting me. Those questions are so important. Thanks, Mame-Fatou, also for your introduction. I think it's so precious, the work that you're doing. Thanks, Yunus. That was so thorough. Thanks, everybody. So yeah, Raft of Medusa is like, shows a lot of the things that, Mame-Fatou was talking about, how we try to erase, questions of race and the whole history of colonialism and, I think it's like, not necessarily that we don't talk about race, we talk about race through institutions when, and when it's about the others, when it's in Brazil, when it's in the United States, but like, Afro-French people, Afro-French artists talking about race is, it's, I mean, like, I don't know, I haven't seen no exhibits about, that question from Afro-French people. So I'm about to show you my presentation that kind of talks about, how I grew up and what we saw around us, and how it influenced my work. It's kind of give you like a little bit more context. So yeah, my name is Alexi Peskin. Grew up in Paris, born in '79. Grew up in the '80s. So I'm gonna show you a lot of the images that we saw in the '80s as a kid. Those are the images that you could see, in the public space. Kids books from like Tintin Congo showing display, like that's like, one of the most famous one, but there was so many displaying, images of clear white supremacy and European supremacy, and insulting images from that was on the right. On the left, you have Banania, which is like a, hot cocoa brand. So that's also what we saw there, even other things that I haven't shown because there's so many, like from the cookies called Bamboula, which means Sembo, to this advertising. You could just walk in the streets in the metro and see those types of insulting advertisings for free time, saying "À quelle sauce je vais manger le blanc." It's a wordplay saying, with what sauce am I going to eat the white, wordplay between white men and white meats. And on the left, a reference to Josephine Baker with the bananas, reference like, suggesting the monkey, the animals. You see the eyes, the wide eyes, the smile. So so many images, like hundreds and hundreds. But I pretty much jumped to this drawing that I did when I was 8 years old. Kind of deconstructing already and reconstructing my own identity, with a little bit more sense of pride. So I have this, I have Desmond Tutu on it, Arlène Désir, which was like also an activist and a politician in the 80s in France. Gilberto Gil, my family's from Brazil. So, like he was definitely like, a big influence in talking about resistance and race. There's typos in the names because I was only 8 years old. Angela Davis and Yannick Noah was the last French person actually to win the French Tennis Open in '83. Kind of suck at home. Jump to the 2000s. On the left, you have the new version of Banania because they heard that it was, a little bit racist. So they try to, bring a new face to Banania, but they came up with this. I mean, like this, they didn't really understand the memo. And then on the right, you have a shooting in the Vogue magazine with blackface. Yeah, also blackface is like it's a big denial, like, in front, there's a big denial about blackface, and this saying that, it's imported, we're importing it from the US and everything. This is another blackface advertising in late 2000s. So the biggest sports paper in France, L'Équipe, was advertising its TV station, and they wanted to reference the 1992 Dream Team. And so they used blackface for that. And on the site, they had the making of, where apparently they had a lot of fun and they thought it was a great idea to show that. So I'm gonna jump quick to that because like that's what Mame-Fatou talked about in our Assemblée Nationale. This fresque done by artists to commemorate the abolition of slavery. The artist is not Black or Afro-descendant, and the art is insulting, and we're paying our taxpayers' money. So this is showing also the resistance, because we're not just passive about it. We go in the streets and I think about our voices and not very seldom heard, but we always protest. This was a protest after the Jean-Paul Guerlain, of the inventor of a famous cologne brand that's part of the LVMH group, Louis Vuitton, Moet, and Hennessy. Declared at the 1 o'clock news that was telling the story how he made this famous cologne, trying to seduce a woman that he loved, and he said that he started to work like a nigger, in front of everybody at the 1 o'clock news, and they say, "Oh, I don't know if niggas ever really worked," and this caused the news anchor to laugh. And nobody said anything about it. So, a lot of people went down the streets and protested. So good. Going up from that, this is showing when we grew up in France, when you're not white, there was always this underlining, people question where you from, where you from? I'm born in Paris, the capital of France, but people always would ask where you from, which is this kind of unsaid, unspoken hierarchy of Frenchness and citizenship, and basically saying that we weren't legit. So when I came to the States, I went to Howard University and studied there, HU. I realized how French I was leaving France, actually, because as in my country, I wasn't really considered fully French, or other people who look like me or darker or from North Africa or from Asia, always not from, or whose parents were from. But, no matter how many generations you're born in France, it's you always have this questioning. So when I went to Howard, when I went to the States, people were actually calling me Frenchie, which was pretty new for me. So I kind of made this piece on the left called Mariam as an affirmation of Frenchness. Marianne on the right, from Liberty Leading the People of Eugène Delacroix, is the symbol of the Republic, of the French Republic, and of the French Revolution. And so me making a Black woman as Marianne was an affirmation for me. And also I call it Mariam, which is a West African name, and also Muslim West African name, because even though France actually is Muslim, French is Islam, French, is Jewish, French is Black, because we have some of the highest population of, Muslims in France, and of Black, in Europe, and of Black people, but we're not considered as such. So that's why I used also a Muslim name, for that, to show that that's France is us, Yeah, it's the same piece, Garvey's. So also in 2016, have you seen my video Raft of Medusa? I was, appalled by the images, and our bodies have been dehumanized through history. The problem is that France sweeps things under the rug and acts slavery and colonialism is a thing of the past. Well, colonialism is very active. Right now as we speak, and in some other shape or form, and slavery, the effects of it, police brutality, even on myself, repeatedly, throughout my youth, and even worse on other people, it's because our bodies have been dehumanized, and so I wanted to show, the fact that in the news, people would show Black bodies, dead bodies, at the 8 o'clock news, is because there's still some of that. and it hasn't been deconstructed because it's swept under the rug. So I wanted to talk about that, to talk about through, because seeing those boats sinking made me think of Raft of Medusa, Théodore Géricault's painting, because it was in 1816, and I did this piece, Raft of Medusa, and it was actually a whole installation at the Biennale de Dakar in Senegal 200 years later. Because I think that, you know, when they talk about on the news, when they spoke about how you know, people coming from sub-Saharan Africa was a problem, they never spoke on why people were leaving their countries. They spoke about what we did to their countries and what we do to their countries to impoverish them and to like actually exploit them, and also how we make it more difficult for people in certain regions of the world to travel. So they have no choice but to go illegally, and they want to see the world. I think it's like, you know, one of like the most important rights. I'm a big traveler, and you know, like, you know, that's people's rights, you know, birthright to be able to travel. So from that's the whole Raft of Medusa exhibit. Those are some of my nail works. I work my power figures. I was influenced by the Nkisi Mpondi power figures of the Congo, and I created these images. So I use some of the most like precarious, I would say, jobs that I saw in Senegal, and that kind of like was an incentive for people to want to leave and go somewhere else, you know. Yeah, so that was like images from Raft of Medusa. And after showing at the Biennale in Dakar, I was invited to do a solo show at the French Institute of Dakar. Those are images from that. Now, this is like the biggest piece I ever did. It's 25 feet high. And it's made with pallets. It was kind of like two pallets as a reference to the dockers looking at the sea and longing for something different. I also like worked with piroguier artists, like artists making canoes in Senegal, which are really beautiful and make everything by hand. And those are like photographs from that video that you saw. I also make the costumes, and I work a lot with fashion in my work, and I use metaphors like, you know, the little Eiffel Towers as a crown of thorns. This is my series Aljana Moons, also shot in Senegal. Power figures. That was my first solo show at the October Gallery. That represents my work. So all these pieces are made with nails, like all the little dots that you see there, nails, and with gold leaf on top of them. All those pieces are moon gold, and they range from like 2 meters 50 to like 1 meter. So like 8 feet. And this is from my like last show, Fire Figures. Fire Figures, I made it actually like while we were on the lockdown. And I mean, basically it's like this whole violence, everything, police violence, like that's something that I've seen my whole life, and like actually normalized at some point. Even though I spoke about it in my art, I normalized that there's some things that I live, that we live, that we think is normal, that we, you know, I mean, because you got to stay sane. But, you know, as everybody saw, kind of, you know, imploded and exploded as we were like confined. So I made the show. We're hesitating to actually do a show in 2020 and I just ran with it. Like I only had like 2 months to make it. I expressed like everything in 15 pieces. I was trying to do 10 and then I went with 15. It was crazy. And so I used things like bisap, which is sorrel, how you call that? Hibiscus, with reference to West Africa, and also that looks bloody, to talk about the legacy of slavery and how, you know, so-called masters went in our homes and invaded our homes and sacred places, and how they still do that, whether you're in the United States, whether you're in France, without warrants, and how they killed Stephen Clark. So this is like a piece that has his grandmother's name because he was killed in his grandmother's house in front of his babies too. The one on the right is called Brianna. So the same way she was killed. And I started doing landscapes in that's like, in relation to the Black experience. And so my work is about the Black experience on a global level, but I'm like definitely want to have more of a work of Afro descendants in the institutions. But the problem is that the institutions are flawed. But we'll talk about that probably later. But yeah, we think that institutions are universal, and they're not. They're white Eurocentric, and so I think the main thing is to create our own thing and still work with institutions. But I think the first problem is to believe that, as Yunsang was actually showing really well, and Mame-Fatou as well, that the institutions are not, our friends to start with, like really, like historically, So that's why we have to actually, like, remix them and change those flaws. So I think we are to like to continue doing that. But we also are to like, and that's what we're doing, and we've been doing, create our own spaces, to influence that. Thank you.
So, wow, that was amazing. I just want to thank you all for sharing your work and sharing your scholarship. I and a number of attendees have questions. There are over 200 people in attendance, but I'm going to take advantage of my privilege as moderator and ask the first question. And actually, I want to just riff off something Alexi was just talking about, which is how institutions are flawed, which is sort of a running theme in all your talks. So I'm wondering, thinking about like our training and our education, many of us are actually attached to these institutions. And I'm wondering, how do we grapple with the fact that, we get our paychecks from these institutions, but at the same time, be critical of those institutions and sort of expose that problematic history? And how do we change them? Does it come from outside of the institution, or does it come from within, or does it come from both?
Okay. Could I go, or should I still even know?
Of course.
I think it's a matter of doing both. But like I said, I think we gotta create our own, because and without, like, I'm not saying like, not work with the institutions, but I think like we are to value more what we create. And I think the reason why the institutions now are like, engaged in those conversations is because they saw what we created, next to that. And they see in anyway, we like, we got the creativity, we got the influence, like, and it's not like, so also it's like, it's a money thing. Like they're seeing that we're killing it. Like, so it's not just that, like, so we're relevant. Like, we have the goal, we create the thing. Like, we create the art, we create the expression. Also, like, we're as human beings, we're more challenged, and we've been historically more challenged. So the artistic expression that comes out of us as human beings and as artists are like powerful. You know what I'm saying? So this goal, our creation that we got it. So, like the only thing is that we generally don't have the money, but we've been creating like, parallel things, our own things. And so the thing, like in a place like France, is that like, or they show us like, oh, see, like you're auto segregating yourself and everything. And I think like the thing is like to not care about these things, like keep on doing what we're doing. And 99% of the time, then the institutions follow and they realize, we need to include them, and because then they become obsolete without us. That means straight up. So I think we are to continue to do that. But I mean, some people won't work with them, but I think you can work with them because, like, also that you get more exposure And it's cool also to, change them for the better, because that's what people, they're the most powerful, and that's where they're the most known or whatever. They're like the biggest platforms. But at some point, we're going to become bigger platforms as well. So, yeah, I would say both, but don't underestimate like ours.
Oh my God, I can go. I mean, I don't think I really have to deal with that question. I'm French, and most of my work is not in France, is not welcomed in France for a very simple reason. Actually, a couple of weeks ago, Alexis and I attended a meeting with top curators in France. I mean, it was literally 20 top curators in the country. And we asked them the question, I mean, like the D word, right? How do you diversify your portfolio? What does diversity mean for you? And you remember the answer, Alexi? Most of the work was geared to undocumented immigrants, right? Helping undocumented immigrants to get a taste of France, because to be French is to get into French culture, right? And also lots of like this social window of taking kids who are at-risk kids, delinquent, or older immigrant women who've been in France for 40 years, 50 years, but still don't speak French. And so that was it. And then you realize that there's a whole generation of people and artists like me and Alexi who are not on their radar. And that really makes it easy for me to answer that question. As far as French is concerned, I don't exist in their radar, but it doesn't, prevent me from doing my work from all the locale that I am, whether it's, from Brazil, Senegal, or in the US. I live in the US. I come from a country that claims to be blind to color, but a country that asked me to go back to Africa the minute I go beyond the two frames of public intervention that are said to be available to me, silence and gratitude. And as soon as I encroach out of these two enclosures, I'll be asked to go back to Senegal, a country that my family initially left in 1835. And it's really this question of, it's the way also people think about what diversity is, or how we can have this conversation, who's allowed to have this conversation, who's a legitimate producer of knowledge, and who is allowed to shake us out of this comfort zone that people create in cultural institutions in France. And it's really just like, who are you? How dare you question, doubt, criticize? How dare you, build these new plans when everything has been, created by the Republic, and universalism is the answer to everything? And how dare I be inspired by the work of people like, Maryse Condé and France Fanon, the Nardole sisters? How dare I be moved by, the work of Alexi, whatever, Rokhaya Diallo is doing, Bintou Dembélé, and to all the people who are telling us this is not our vision of Frenchness, and this is not what we think at the work of art is. I'll just ask them, go and watch choreographer Bintou Dembélé dance on stage. Go watch someone like Gertine Ambury and look at them and unravel on stage what it means to be Black in French, what it means to be Black in France, what it is to grow up in this country as a woman and Black, a woman and Muslim, a woman and Maghrebi, etc. So most of us, we had to come to terms that as far as making a living, we couldn't count on France. But I think that's also, it made our position stronger, because actually we don't depend on the country to make a living. And I realized that, for example, in the example of the fresco, I had many people telling me that you are able to do this because you don't live in France, you don't work in France, and everything, all your means of living would have been cut. As a university professor, you would have not been able to have this campaign because the university would have not given you the freedom. So, it's also how being in different locales can also help, ease your freedom of expression.
Thank you. I can offer brief comments. Thank you, Jonathan, for such a rich question. So something that this is a question that I think about all the time as someone who works at a university and who interacts with museums all the time in my research and so forth. And the thing that and it's an ongoing, I think, negotiation, this question, the way that all of us sort of negotiate this question of like, what does it mean to work with the institutions that we've been critical of or we're critical of, and what is that interaction? What's the tension between antagonism and just the sanity of like the lives that we're living. And the thing that I think a lot about is something that Gayatri Spivak says in terms of what she calls like intimate sabotage. And she cites women in the secretaries, women in the Algerian war who would go to their offices earlier than their shift started to send communique for the resistance. That like part of sabotage is that you have to know how to use the machine in order to break the machine. So I think that that's something that's really important, that there is a kind of, I think, an outsider romance that the rupture of the institution is going to come from a very far away place. But oftentimes those of us who work within the institution, I think, at least for me, I see where I see the critiques so much more clearly because I'm working inside of the pits of those critiques. And I think that that's something to keep in mind. And simultaneously, the narrative of like, if someone works at an institution, they are compromised and therefore they cannot have a critique, actually puts the onus on marginalized communities to be actually like fully funded, fully separate, fully on their own. And if that was the case, like, why would there be any interaction to be critical of the institutions? I think that it's very real that there are certain institutions that have monopolies on knowledge production, on certain kinds of aesthetic production. And it will be a process of creating other kinds of institutions, but also fundamentally problematizing, but also abolishing how we think of various institutions that we're working in today. Like, I would like for the narrative to be shifted that there are some people who work there and therefore that means we're compromised. And in order to not be compromised, you have to be entirely outside of it. I would like to complicate it so that I want to know like why certain people are just considered the owners of X, Y, and Z forever. I mean, why are certain legacies just kind of maintained? I would like for those narratives to be constantly provoked.
Great, thank you for those responses. I want to turn to the chat because there are a lot of questions in the chat. And the first question I want to get to is actually posed by Susanna Burns. And Susanna asks, she wants to know where you all are based, if you're based in the US, and how might that influence your art and your opinions. And Susanna, if you don't mind, I want to add on to your question, because one thing that strikes me about your work, Alexi, and even your work, Mom, is that it's very diasporic. Like, Mom, you're based at an American university, but your work is about race in France. And Alexi, your family's from Brazil, you were raised in France, but you were also educated in the US. So I'm wondering how a diasporic perspective or a transnational perspective might be influencing your ideas and your art.
Yeah, to me, I think like my personal mission actually is like Pan-Africanism in general. Like I'm seeing that like there's like like we always say that we've been like we're like like our mirror has been like shattered all around the world. And the problem is right now is like we don't speak the same languages. We don't really understand each other's culture. It's like a lifetime work to actually even get that knowledge and put those pieces back together for like Black Americans to understand people in Senegal or in other places in Africa or in Rwanda or wherever, or South Africa, for South Africans to understand Afro-Brazilians, for Afro-Brazilians. So it's like that's my mission. So you would tell them about like where I grew up in France, and how my family's from Salvador Bahia in Brazil. But also I felt like how I studied in the States at HU, Howard University, Mecca, like, of like so many people from all around the States, Black culture and everything. But also all around the world, there were people from Nigeria and everything. It was like amazing. Anyway, but I also realized that I need to have a broader understanding on the African continent. So, one of my main like life goals is to get to visit, but thoroughly, like, all 54 countries, before I'm 50. Like, so That's something that I do. Like I've like lived in Senegal like for about like 8 years, like on and off, like traveling throughout, other places and stuff. So I think like that's kind of how I do it. Like wherever I go, I really want to understand. Even when I do shows, like I favor doing residencies in those places to really understand the place and not just go and do a show there, right? So I think that's like I think for me the main thing is really having this understand the world and kind of like dig in knowledge, right? I don't know if it answers really your question, but like that's to me that's my main how I navigate through that, right?
Oh, I really like that. So for me, I realized that to be Black within the European modernist project is to, or that's what we're told, right? To live on the fringe of official narratives, to often exist in the dead angles and silences. But it also means I found out that we are never alone. We are constantly surrounded by what I call the silences of history. And I call my body of work, from the photo to my book, that's actually, the cover is taken from Alexis's film. I call it a sonarchaeology of sounds and silence, both in writings and in our live environment. How can we unlearn the way we were taught to learn, to listen, and learn new ways of listening through traveling, right? And I investigate the means that Black people have developed to domesticate, to harness those silences. And for example, this is what we are doing when we push, for example, in France right now against the rhetoric of surprise around the current climate. Oh my God, this is the first time, we've never seen this. This is unprecedented, right? While many seems lost and struck by the novelty of the event, people are discovering about race, people are discovering about, police violence, people are discovering about the need to have race conversation in public forums such as museum. And we've lived with these silences, and through this companionship with silence, we've acquired a sense of a longer history of the present. And this is something that I feel so comfortable with. And even when I go to Rio de Janeiro and I don't speak Portuguese, but I can feel this connection in Senegal, in Ghana. And back in grad school, there was a sentence that blew my mind. And in the course of working towards my dissertation, it came to me that the ultimate mark of power, right? When Tuyo says that power history is never so strong that it cannot be disintegrated by trying to unsilence it. That sentence really blew my mind. And that this invisibility of power was also its biggest flaw. And now that we are defining or redefining silence, exposing its mechanism, the emperor nakedness means that he's naked, right? We do not believe in, so we're told that the clause has fictitious properties. And in France, for example, this is what's happening with the unraveling of the universally school aid, right? The good crowd is still expressing admiration at the emperor's clause, but a little boy yells in the crowd, the emperor has no clause. And in the Africana context, it's not one little boy, but an entire choir that is calling the emperor on his nonsense, right? And for us, this choir, it's in France, it's Sylviane Larcher, Olivette Hotel, Maboula Soumaoro, Annette Joseph Gabriel, etc. My mother, my aunts, and all these people the connection that I built. And just to finish, so this little metaphor really highlights for me the importance of building global networks and transnational collaboration. And I highlight it oftentimes to my students, like travel if it's possible, and if not, observe anti-Blackness at work outside of the boundaries of your own country. For me, to be Black in France is not the same thing than to be Black in Pittsburgh, right? What are the mechanisms of anti-Blackness in those localities? What is the quality of the silences around Blackness or anti-Blackness? And I cannot stress how pivotal my being in the US had been for my understanding of negrophobia in France. And I do this while stressing, what we just said, that anti-Blackness is a global disease that will not go away with a local remedy. So just to finish, operating in an Africana context, really helped me work around the way we've been trolled. I call this being trolled in the Western project, right? And yeah.
I love that you referenced Michelle Roth-Truo, Silencing the Past.
Oh, I can't do anything without Truo. I cannot do anything. I mean, he useless. I mean, everybody should read this book, Silencing the Past.
Yeah, but thinking about his work and thinking about last summer 2020, do you think, and I'm thinking specifically about France, do you think that was a turning point? You mentioned that you had a meeting with a number of curators. You and Alexi had a meeting with a number of curators who were interested in diversity. And someone asked in the chat, like, how many of those curators were people of color? Like, do you see zero?
Of color, I mean, one, like North African, Black, zip.
So Alexi said, for this to happen, some of you is gonna have to lose that spot.
I told her straight up, like, I mean, they were like telling, like, I mean, it's beautiful to bring culture in jails, like, but yo, dude, like, if you try, like how do I get your job? Like, do I have to be in jail, like, to get your job? Like, if I'm studying art and I want to be a curator or something, that like I or what's up, like, because that's all they were given. That's all the solutions they were given. Although but somebody born in France that's Black and that wants to be their colleagues or boss, like, there was no solution. And so the thing is, like, what was interesting about that is that, like, France invisibilized race, but they did something actually, I think, really, like, because, like, they try to, like, have a blind eye on that, like, on purpose. Like, I always like to compare it to, like, feminism and being a woman, because, for instance, they did parody, which is great. Parody is, like, they were saying that now, I think it's like in the 90s, they were like, okay, now there's a problem. There's not enough, like, women, like, in the workforce, or, I mean, there's problems with salaries. So now, even like in the government, so it was like 50% of people employed need to be women. And that's like, and it changed everything. Like, even when we were like, but with Black people, they don't want to do that. It was like, oh yeah, they don't like this idea. But if they said, okay, at least 10% or 15% or 20% got to be like non-white, then it would change everything. Like that would be more. But they don't want to do that. They don't want to address these things, and they kind of want to act like we're this, like, racist place, like that we're a country of, like, human rights. We can't be like the country of human rights when you enslave, like, like, you're on the top 3 enslavers, when you colonize half of the world, probably, like, the whole world, if you do it with Britain and Portugal. So I'm saying, like, so that's a big problem. That's France. But there was so many earlier when I was talking about institutions. I was just talking about institutions. What I answered wasn't just about institutions in France. It was in Brazil, in the US. I just want to clarify that my answer was, like, globally, not just France. I wasn't just talking about France.
But I would love to. There was a question in the chat directed towards you, Song. An attendee named Elizabeth thought your perspective on philanthropy, museum building, and collecting was really interesting. And in particular, I'm going to read the question verbatim. What stereotypes do you interpret in the Batman episode as critiquing? The image of the penguin, and probably any more so than the early 1990s advertising for the movie franchise, is clearly anti-Semitic. The discourse on the nefarious Jewish dealer is well-trodden. I'm curious what you found in your research of the different types of stereotyping of non-white WASP participants in an elite-driven art world of the Gilded Age.
Thank you for that question. Thank you for reading it, Jonathan, and thank you, Elizabeth, for asking it. I think that the Batman episode, for those of you who have seen it, and if you have not, it's pretty great, because what happens then is, like, Joker sets up a school, and then Batman thinks that the rich are being cheated out of their money by attending this art school, and then he tries to rescue the rich from attending the art school, and they are very much convinced that they do not need rescuing. So it's a it's a strange and lovely episode. But I think that some of the stereotypes or the kinds of satire that I was picking up on is it actually goes through the canonical art, the canonical painters of art history. So it one of the other sort of parodies was like a Leonardo da Vinci character who's on a part of the international art contest. And I think that something that the episode is playing with, and I don't think that this is what the writers of the episode would necessarily discuss, but that's why I brought up Raymond Williams, that it's a kind of overall feeling that there are kind of strange things that happen in art and we're not really sure. Other people aren't really sure. Like, why does Joker's blank canvas win? Like, what is this like kind of strangeness of art? And why does the wealthy seem to be so interested in this realm? And I thought that would just be like a way for us to talk about how is this thing called philanthropy and the arts perceived culturally. In terms of the stereotypes, the racialized stereotypes to Jewish dealers in particular, I think that someone like Joseph Devine is the person that a lot of people have written, like there's been a lot of discourse around his role as a dealer. And I think that for my research and just the things that I'm interested in, rather than focusing on individual kind of the bureaucrats in between, I'm much more interested in kind of institutions and structures and how they're built. And so I would like to shift the attention away from like the middleman to the actual person who is building the institution and building the institution with all of his friends and is able to finance those endeavors. I think that that's a lot more of an important kind of focus for us to have.
Yeah, I mean, I have another question. I know you're more interested in sort of the origin moment or like institution building, but I can't help but think about donors and like the politics of like gift giving in museums and how that's also often quite problematic. And I'm wondering if there's just thinking about solutions, like how can museums do better? Like what's a better way of sort of navigating the fact that, they have these relationships with very wealthy individuals who often are wealthy from very unsavory, origins. Like, how do we sort of negotiate that, like the modern issue of ownership?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the bigger question that we'll have to ask is, why is this the way that the arts are funded? Like, why is it that there's a kind of a very incestuous relationship between art institutions, donors, patrons, and philanthropy? What has been the systematic breakdown of funding for the arts by public governments across the world? Why is the arts considered this kind of excessive realm, like as a kind of educational endeavor or as a kind of career choice, when it's the very thing that the donor class seems to consistently also partake in? Like, I really think about this. There's a part about Carnegie that I almost presented on, but I decided to cut, where when he built these libraries, he wanted to insert what he called useful information. He wanted these libraries to have useful information, and this was information that would be about working or science or business that, and it was basically just like not the arts. But simultaneously, he was trying to write a novel, and Frick is collecting paintings. So what does it mean that like everyone else has access only to this thing called use? And for them, it's like this realm of non-use. And so from there, I would even push further and say, like, what do we not recognize because of these very stringent categories that are pre-formed between like the object that they collect that's considered art, or the novels that they write because they sponsor? And then what about all the other forms of aesthetic expression that are under-recognized or underutilized or perhaps not even known to us, because we have these very formalized categories of what art is supposed to be? And I think that all of these questions are sort of wrapped up in like, what is a donor? Who is the donor? What are those conversations? And how come this is the conversation that is that gets circled back to when we're thinking about something like the art space, like who's funding it and so forth. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I would love to actually go to a question posed by an attendee named Rachel. And this is for everybody. They wrote, you're all coming at the need for remixing and changing institutions. And she was paraphrasing Alexi, from a combination of academic, artistic, and protest lens. How do you envision those various disciplines combining to move institutions away from their capitalist, racist foundations into something new, some new possible futures?
That's a great question. That's the question was about the old institutions or the new ones, the ones being built.
How do you sort of remix or reformulate existing institutions to sort of make them less racist and less capitalist and sort of create a new future with them?
I mean, that's I don't even know that I have the answer for that, because like that's, yeah, I mean, like shaking the whole system
by existing, by creating, by being.
Yeah, but in the institution itself, you know, like basically, you know, how you redistribute the power and everything, like, you know, by calling out, you know, and such things. But yeah, like that's that's a tough one, because like that, I mean, we're not the people in power, even though we're the creators and everything, but we're not the people in power. You know, to change that, you have to be empowered and to, you know, awaken and realize these things and be willing to be more fair, you know. So I think it's more a question of like awakening or shaking the people at the top, you know, who got that right, and to be more fair in redistribution and in ethics and everything, you know. But yeah, as the creators, like, you know, you can't only like talk about it, you know, expose it, and try to be, you know, better yourself too, you know, like, because like you were saying earlier, like, you know, at some, like we all are part of, you know, since like the problems are in place, like, you know, everyday ubiquitous, you know, so we all take part in that. It's like how we break away from it, like, you know, it's difficult, you know. There's many questions about that, because like there's so many things, even like snap, like there's so many things, like even like as an artist, where do you show? Like I showed at the French Institute. It's the belly of the beast, you know. That's an institution that's kind of like, you know, that's soft power for colonialism, and I talked about colonialism in that institution, you know. Or if you're like in many places on the continent, and you're trying to show like some, like the only places where you might have like money or that might fund the arts are either like colonial things or big things like Total. And so if, I don't know, if you're from a family already that like that they understand you being an artist, you're always trying to like hustle as an artist and now like you have to put your work out. That's a really great question, because sometimes like even just everywhere from like the institution you're gonna show in, the place you're gonna show in, to who's gonna buy your work, whether, like, you know, like that's a tough question. You know, it's because some, like, you know, some people check, but like it's like to check everything on you know, even the galleries, like, I mean, a lot of it is like laundering. Like this is like so much like, you know, everything is like has some kind of like is rotten somewhere. So I mean, like, you know, you think it's like you got to be as ethical as possible. Yeah, but I think it's like and call out problems, but it's, I think, very difficult to do it all at once and be like, oh yeah, I'm gonna change everything at once. You know?
And especially for us, I just wanted to add, especially for us in the French context, I mean, if you think, I'm not even going, 1,000 years ago, but, starting at the 16th century with the Renaissance, when we came with the idea that to be French was to speak French, and to be French was to have this French culture, and the way culture, the arts, right, writing, painting, architecture became an integral part of the French DNA, the Frenchness, and became absolutely embroidered with the way the national narrative was being created, and this idea that is really fundamental for us, that Frenchness is not about blood, Frenchness is not about ethnicity. It's a group of people who've done great things together in the past, and from there they find the glue, the energy to stay together, and the energy to spring together in the future. And in all of that, the national narrative, the roman national, and the way it's built by historian, artists is absolutely key. And in the middle of all that, you have language, culture, and the arts. They're just absolutely the spine of that roman national. And if you look at, French historians in the room will agree with that. From the 16th century to the 17th century, you have all, like from the François Ier, the Louis XIV, all the king who really built that essence, the way art was absolutely essential for French identity. And even the revolution took away the monarchy, but did not take that. So for us, we're really coming and fighting with something that has been absolutely ossified, the role of art as being the prerogative of the state. And someone said it's very difficult to build an institution, especially when art, France is known for its exception culturelle. You can talk about, money. Art is not about money. Art is not about capitalism. Art is about identity and culture. So for us today, when you're coming from a perspective where your work is questioning the very roman national that your art is supposed to celebrate and create, it doesn't work. And it's this exactly, remember, Alexi, someone asked you, how, after your presentation, how come you're not exposed in France? How come, you're in one of the best gallery in England? How come you're invisible here? And it's so ironic that people are shocked to not know about Afro-French artists, but it's the same system that keep us away that is now shocked that we're not here. So it's hard, and we are really, and I'm giving this bit of historical context, this idea about l'exception culturelle française, to give an idea of people about what we are up against. But for me, we're not going to build a museum of African French history, right? It's not going to happen in the next 5-10 years, but it will happen. And I think time will be our best friends, and just, like I say, be here, create. Our work speak for us, and our work, it's like these little éclats, mosaics here and there, and one day they will be all in one place.
Yeah, actually, I forgot to say also, because that seemed pessimistic also what I said a little bit, but I think I was thinking one of the most important things also is like the values that so for instance, I work with young men and women of African descent, and I take them a lot to, like, when I'm invited to do residencies, like generally I try to include them in that for them to see that. But so they get opportunities, but I think what's most important in what the things, like when you bring someone with you and you help them out or something, like it's also to bring down your values and to be like, okay, what I'm doing, you are to be doing for the next generation. So it's like, things like what I'm doing is like as a super small, it's at a super small scale. It's like, how I can do it, with my own means when I get an opportunity, right? But I think what's important is also, actually, even like as we're talking right now, is to give those values to the people that, that we move, that we interact with, right? I think that's really important. And so try to do it to do good. Like, it's not just like things, like not just criticize, but try to do things. But then also the people that you do good for, try to also like give those values and tell them to pass on. Like, for instance, as simple as that. Right now, like I'm the only Black artist in the 30 studios in the studios that I'm at, right? And so a studio open, I'm trying to bring more Black folks in, but so hopefully if they get in, then I want them to get another Black person, in as well. So that there's the thing, like it's like the values, but then that's like of like helping, but then also the moral values, of not exploiting, not like not get yourself lost in the process. I think, but like what's really important is the values, the core, and have the conversations. Even if you blow up, like try to keep it humble within,
And a quick add-on to that relates to what you just said, because I'm really interested to hear what you wanna add about this. In France, so yeah, art is mostly funded by the government, but in the past decades, there's been foundations and private donors like Pinault, Lagardère, and also foundations like Total Foundation that Alexi mentioned, Fondation Cartier. But it's very interesting to see that most of their work towards, our perspective is also heavily geared towards African artists. And this is also where the conversation around race gets very interesting, because they will tell you, oh, we have this amazing Black artist who's exposing, but it will be someone from Ghana, someone from Nigeria. And it really makes it so clear. It's, those noisy silences, why we don't want an art by a Black guy from Lyon or Marseille, because the questions that they will ask, we are absolutely happy. They'll be happy with having someone who's denouncing, Total's, involvement in the civil war or part of the civil war in Nigeria or things like that. But French issues like police violence in France, not here. So it's very interesting also to see even that opening that we've seen in the past decades with private donors. And the fact that, like someone say, money talks, right? Principle talks, but money speaks louder. And if they realize that your art is valuable, they will. But we still have this Republican dam, even coming from private donors and private foundations. Where, we were just 2 years ago, I remember, Alexi, the Modèle Noir exhibition at the Musée d'Orsay. It's the first major exhibition like that. And the funny thing is that when it was in New York, the curator wanted the exhibit to end with the perspective of Black artists on white bodies. And when it came in Paris, there was a huge brawl, because at the end, the one Black artist, so the Black artists were Harlem, painters from 1920s Harlem, and that one Black guy from, where was he from? Cameroon. And the curators absolutely refused to include any Afro-French artists, because they say that there were no Afro-French artists. And this is 2019, Alexi?
Yeah,
so,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I think like this is something really interesting also about what you're saying, because the politics of it all, because like you're talking about France, but it's the same thing in the US or in Brazil. Like, so the reason in France you won't have Afro-French artists, because the system, the government, like everything, they don't want you to burn down the house or whatever, like, by telling the truth. But, in the US, like it's also, you have the same thing where, they'll like, like for instance, like with Black America, like a lot, like they won't be favored. Somebody coming from Nigeria or Jamaica might be favored next to a Black American. So all this is like political, like, like for instance, somebody like in China might not be able to talk about like problems about the government, but then the US, because they're in the Cold War or whatever, and they want to show the problems there, then they bring all the artists, that were silenced there, and they bring them to it. So it's like, it's a game. I think like what's really important about that is, even though in staff ethics, even though you're going to be invited in the US to talk about, the problems in France, or as a Black American, you're invited to France to talk about the problems in the US. You like, the thing is to like, peep game and understand how your folks in France or in the US like are struggling, and so you have to like, open your eyes to that, and kind of like, it's Pan-Africanism, like, it's like realize that, and even though you're invited and everything, you still need to call out on these things and have some kind of solidarity and understanding of the global thing. Like, and I'm talking about Blackness, but this transcends to like to a lot of like other mechanisms, but the idea is to because like you can like, you have to also understand like the problems of identity. You have to understand the the same issues are going on for LGBTQ I people, for like, women, for everything. So, I think there needs to be this solidarity in general. I think it's like it's important to understand the powers that be and the problems and that everybody faces, and kind of like to have some kind of solidarity about it in general,
Great. I mean, I would love to, let's see, there's a great question in the chat that was posed to Yoon-sung.
Yes, I want to hear that too.
Oh, did I cut you off? Sorry.
No, I say I love it, and I want to hear more about intimate sabotage.
Oh, yeah.
It was going to be my question. It was going to be my question.
And so I hope it's clear that that's something that Gayatri Spivak talks about. So that's not like that I said that earlier, but that should be very clear that that's something that Spivak talks about. But I could talk more about, so I think that this question of cross-racial solidarity is really interesting. And Christina Sharp is here with us today, and she has spoken a lot about how we might have to move away from the language of solidarity and towards distributive risk or distributed risk. I think that there is a kind of romanticism around this notion that we can have it all and we can work together. And I think the current reality that we're living in is that there is anti-Blackness being perpetrated by non-Black communities, Asian American communities in the US and all over the world. I think the forces of white supremacy and anti-Blackness are very different. So if we're really thinking of, like this earlier question that you were all sort of taking up, like how do we undo the racist foundations of museums? I think that would be a process of undoing all the foundations of all the institutions. So it will have to be a concerted effort. It can't actually just begin siloed within the museum. It will have to take place in higher education and government and prison systems. There will have to be a complete overhaul. And this process might not be that we all live the same and we have everything that we have. It might be that some of us give many things up and that there's risk. And that is, I think, a different place that, that's a very different place from like the ways in which perhaps our movements have been narrated in the past, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, we have a few minutes left. I'm wondering if anyone has any concluding thoughts, any words to part on.
I mean, I kind of that really made me think about, I think one thing we didn't talk about was reparations, straight up. If you talk about the institutions, how they got you talk about education and putting people in these places, the institutions are, but like you were saying, in some, it's a lot of people gotta give up their seats, man. You gotta change it all. I saw something that that was quite interesting in Rio, at the Museum of Art of Rio, is that they had a program where they were getting people in the hood, even I forgot the word in English, but trans, there was a trans man, and that was, and people from Black people and people from the hood that were actually being trained in the institutions to later take those spots in those spaces. And I think so again, it was also one of these social programs. What was interesting is that they would later be because there's also a social problem. A lot of people from certain neighborhoods, you very seldom see them the higher you get in these institutions, in those seats, right? So there's also a question. That's why I was talking about reparations. I was thinking about reparations in terms of free education and access to education in certain spots that people don't get. Because like to even get in the institutions, you also need to get to have some kind of education as well. You know, a lot of people don't have access to that, and they come from a history of people that have been oppressed, and these institutions actually benefited from this oppression. So that's why I'm talking about reparations. Like, you know, I mean, that might seem like radical, but I think, like, you know, Black people in America and Brazil like should never pay for school. Not like, you know, like the amount of wealth that was built, they should never, you know, straight up.
Period. I agree. No, these are important issues. You know, reparations. We didn't talk about museum collections or repatriation. There are so many topics that we could have touched on in this panel. So, but thank you. I think you raised a lot of important questions for us to think about, for us to walk away with. So I really appreciated learning from you all and like having this very special moment with you all. So thank you. And thank you everyone in attendance. This was great.
Thank you so much. And we will make this happen one piece at a time.
Thank you so much for moderating, Jonathan.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, John.
Thank you all.